News, the tropics are quiet. Plenty of time to prepare, and now's the time to do it. That is why we have our Hurricane Week here this week, and today we are live down at Murrells Inlet.
Yeah, that's right, Robert. As you said, we are here at Murrells Inlet. We're actually at Bovines, right on the Marsh Walk in Murrells Inlet, and this is really a hot spot to be in the summer, apparently, especially during WMVF Hurricane Week, because we've had a lot of people out here. But one thing with this area, though, too, in the South Strand, it is prone to those devastating storm surges when hurricanes do come through the area.
Yeah, and so many of the iconic images of our area from hurricane damage come from the South Strand and come from Hurricane Hugo, and just how incredibly powerful it was here. The storm surge as high as 13 to 15 feet, and we kind of dug back into the archives and got some of those really incredible pictures from the height of Hurricane Hugo's damage. This one, I think, completely tells the story. This is the scene in Garden City. A 13-foot storm surge is certainly enough to pick up entire houses and push them a block or two inland. There were even a few houses that actually floated into the marsh behind us.
And you have to think, when we're talking Hurricane Hugo, you're talking not only the storm surge we've been talking about in the South Strand from one direction, but both directions. And I remember seeing the photos here, and you could see where some of those houses were transported into the marsh from that record surge. And this is just to show you what a big storm could do to such a flood-prone area.
And absolutely. Wind-wise, Hugo only produced, and I say only in quotes, winds here in Garden City of around 90 miles per hour. But Hugo's impacts all came from storm surge, and it wasn't just here, it extended further south as well.
Yeah, you go down to Pawleys Island, you could see houses completely ripped apart, especially if you remember on with Hugo, the front side of that wind, we were talking hurricane force winds all the way up far enough inland into Charlotte, into North Carolina. Just a beast of a storm that overall not only brought the record surge, but brought some big-time winds for this region.
It did. And as we've been saying off and on, a lot of what we do now, preparing for hurricanes, evacuating, the new evacuation zones, the lane reversals, were all a part of the recovery from Hugo. There were a lot of big issues before and after Hugo in this part of South Carolina. Totally changed how we deal with hurricanes in this part of the state.
Yeah, that's really incredible. And as you were saying, that devastating impact from Hugo is why it is considered the worst natural disaster, at least if you ask most South Carolina residents. They're going to say that's the worst one they can remember. In fact, because of Hugo, just like Jamie just said, state officials reshaped how South Carolina handles evacuation and re-entry protocols. So it is important to remember those evacuation orders are issued for those areas most vulnerable to storm surge flooding. And if you're in an evacuation zone and are ordered to leave, do it. So again, it is important to know what your zone is, and if you are outside of an evacuation zone, your greatest threat is actually from wind. And with today's construction codes, most homes will remain standing even after a strong hurricane. Of course, getting you to safety, though, is the #1 priority. That is when any natural disaster strikes here in our state. And our Ali Espinosa explains the work the Department of Social Services does before, during, and after a hurricane to make sure they're doing just that.
It starts with you getting a notification to your phone, then getting into your car and driving to the closest evacuation zone or shelter. But what determines the need to evacuate during a hurricane?
We live on the beach. Storm surge is probably the #1 thing that we are most concerned about, especially when you start talking about 4 to 6 foot of storm surge.
Myrtle Beach Emergency Management work with local and state agencies to determine the needs of the community during an emergency like hurricanes. Once roads or other areas start to flood and become inaccessible, state agencies will alert local authorities to start evacuating certain areas if they find it necessary.
We can certainly encourage evacuations, letting people know ahead of time what to expect, and if there is a possibility for mandatory evacuation, we'll let them know as soon as possible.
The state's Department of Social Services, the American Red Cross, and Horry County Emergency Management will set up shelters across the Grand Strand for those who are evacuated or stranded during a hurricane. Some Horry County schools can be used as mass shelters as part of an agreement they have with county government. Director of Disaster Services Jim Casterly says shelters will usually be placed along evacuation routes across the state.
Within 2 hours of notification, the DSS staff and the American Red Cross are typically ready to receive shelterees. That doesn't mean there's going to be cots in place. These shelters are shelters of last resort. So supplies will catch up, but the doors will be open to receive evacuees within 2 hours of notification is our standard.
Both Glackey and Casserly say after the storm, it usually starts all over again, cleaning up after and preparing for another natural disaster. But the main goal is to always be ready and keep you safe. In Myrtle Beach, Ali Espinosa, WMBF News.